The girl stood barefoot on the makeshift block, arms folded over her swollen belly, sunlight bouncing off her tangled blonde hair like straw. Her dress clung damp to her thighs, dirt-caked and torn as if it had been someone else's Sunday best long ago. The auctioneer didn't look at her face, only shouted above the flies and heat, swinging his gavel like he was calling out cattle. $4 to start, she can cook clean, not yet 17, carrying a child, yes sir, but ain't that just a head start on family? The crowd jeered and laughed. Someone spat near her feet, someone else whistled. She flinched but didn't cry. Not once. In the back behind the pens where a dying mule wheezed in the shade, a man leaned against the rail, hat low coat dusty from the trail. He hadn't spoken all day, hadn't eaten either. Just drank water from his own canteen and kept to the shadows. When the bidding stalled at $6, the auctioneer grew red in the face. Hell, she's worth feed alone. Anyone else? Then a voice like boots dragging on gravel, 10. All heads turned. The silent man walked forward and dropped a coin purse on the plank. That enough? He asked. No one spoke. The mother, a woman with sun-cracked lips and a tight braid, nodded once and took the coin without looking back. The girl was his. He didn't take her hand, just said, "Get your things," knowing she had none. They left as the crowd turned back to hogs and goats, her shadow long beside his, her silence louder than any scream. Miles away, the land held its breath as if it knew something had just shifted that wouldn't shift back. Elijah Voss hadn't set foot in town in 5 years. Not since the fever took his wife and the child came out cold and blue beneath her ribs. Folks whispered back then that maybe he'd lost his faith or worse, his mind. But he didn't speak to deny them. He simply loaded a wagon with seed and salt, rode out to the broken ridge where his ranch rotted quiet under wind and sky, and closed the gate behind him. That gate hadn't swung open again, not until today. The girl rode behind him on a mule. He seldom used her hands, knotted over her stomach, her eyes too blank to read. Elijah didn't ask questions. He didn't want to know her name. He hadn't gone to the auction to buy a soul, only hay and a box of nails. But when he saw her there on the block, rope marks on her wrists, shoes missing, belly full of life, he thought of the grave out back, the one without a name. And something in him, something older than pain, cracked just enough to speak one word: 10. Now they reached the ranch at dusk. The fence leaned from years of wind. The barn sagged where the south wall had buckled in last spring's flood. A rusted weather vane still turned slowly atop the smokehouse, squeaking in rhythm with the dying light. Elijah tied the mule and stepped off. "You'll stay in the bunkhouse, not the main house." She nodded. No words, no questions. Just followed him as he lit the lantern and opened the side door to the bunkhouse. Dust rose like breath from a coffin. Inside was a narrow cot, an old wood stove, and a bucket with a cracked rim. "Ain't much," he said, "but the stove still works. I'll bring you supper." She sat without a sound. He watched her a moment longer, then left. Back in the main house, he ladled out a portion of beans and cornbread, hesitated, then added a square of salted pork. She was eating for 2. When he returned, she hadn't moved. He placed the plate on a crate beside the cot. "There's a well out back. Drink what you need. Don't go wandering." She didn't thank him, just stared at the floorboards. Elijah walked back to his house without looking back. That night he sat in his parlor, staring at the mantel where a cracked photograph of a dark-haired woman and a small blue pair of baby shoes gathered dust. He remembered her voice, soft, full of laughter, the way her hands folded across her belly in the last months, whispering to the child within. He remembered praying until his knees bled, and the silence that followed when God didn't answer. Now in the next building, another woman carried another child, and God, it seemed, had brought them both to his door. He should have turned away, should have let someone else lift a hand. But the truth was, Elijah Voss didn't believe in fate, only guilt, and when guilt got heavy enough, it moved a man's feet without asking his permission. That night he placed a second log on the fire in the bunkhouse stove before he slept. Quietly, without her knowing. The girl did not speak for 3 days. She rose early before the rooster crowed and sat on the step of the bunkhouse with her knees tucked to her chest, watching the morning mist roll off the hills. When Elijah came to bring food, she nodded once but said nothing. She didn't flinch at his boots, didn't ask where she was. He told her she was safe. She gave no sign of believing him. On the fourth day, he found her bent over the woodpile with an axe in her hands, splitting kindling as though she'd done it all her life. Her back curved heavy with the weight of the child, and sweat darkened the collar of her borrowed dress. "You don't need to do that," Elijah said. She didn't stop, only murmured, "I like the sound." It was the first thing she'd said. He let her work. That evening he brought out a blanket and left it folded on the bunkhouse step. When he passed by later, it was gone. Inside the bunkhouse window, she lay curled on the cot, the blanket pulled up to her chin. Her hand rested on her stomach like a shield. Elijah turned back to his house and said nothing. At supper the next day, she finally asked, "What's your name?" He answered without turning from the fire, "Elijah Voss." She nodded slowly. "Josie." She didn't offer more. He didn't ask. They fell into a rhythm after that. He mended the fence. She tended the garden behind the barn. When her back began to ache, she sat more but refused to rest. Elijah watched her from the porch some evenings, the way she talked to the unborn child, her hand moving in slow circles over her stomach as if sketching a future only she could see. One night, while the sky turned plum-colored and the crickets started their song, she stood at the edge of the field staring at the cottonwoods that marked the far ridge. "Who's buried there?" she asked. Elijah's pipe paused halfway to his lips. "My wife," he said. "And a child." Josie's voice softened. "I'm sorry." He only nodded. Then, after a long pause, she asked, "Did it hurt?" The question came out thin like a thread pulled too tight. He answered without looking at her. "Every day." She didn't ask more, but she stood there beside him a while, silent and still. The next morning he found a small bundle of wildflowers on the grave. She hadn't signed it. She didn't need to. One afternoon a storm rolled in sudden and hard. The wind kicked up dust until the sky turned the color of old iron. Elijah shouted for her, found her struggling to bring the wash off the line before the rain. He grabbed the rope, she grabbed the sheets, and together they wrestled the cloth down as thunder cracked like rifle fire above them. By the time they ducked inside, both were soaked through. For a moment, standing there in the barn doorway, dripping breathless, something passed between them. Not romance, not even warmth, just a quiet acknowledgement of survival. Josie laughed. The sound startled him. What he asked, she shook her head, wiping water from her brow. Nothing, just forgot what it felt like to feel safe even for a minute. Elijah didn't know what to say, so he tipped his hat and walked out into the rain. That night she left a folded note by his supper plate. It said only, "Thank you for not touching me." He folded the note and placed it inside the family Bible. Didn't read it again. Didn't need to. It was the sound of hooves that warned him first. Not the steady clop of passing travelers, but the slow, deliberate gait of men who didn't care if they were heard. Elijah stood on the porch, rifle propped beside the door pipe, cooling in his hand. 3 of them rode in coated with trail dust and bad intentions. Their horses were lathered muscles, tense mouths, frothing like they'd been driven hard with no kindness. The lead rider swung down first, tall and sinewy, with a black coat that flapped like a buzzard's wings. His boots gleamed. His spurs didn't. He didn't take off his hat. "Well, I'll be," he said, voice like sand through a sieve. "Elijah Voss. Didn't expect to see your name still breathing." Elijah didn't smile. "Dalton Pike." "Thought you were dead," Dalton said, stepping up the porch. "Ain't we all one way or another?" Elijah replied. Dalton grinned. It was all teeth. The other 2 riders flanked him, a boy with a twitchy eye and a man with a scar down his neck who cracked his knuckles like they were tired of waiting. "We're looking for someone," Dalton said. "Girl, blonde, pregnant. Took off from a mining camp 3 weeks back. Some say she was taken. Others say she ran." Elijah's jaw didn't move. "Don't know anyone fitting that." "Funny," Dalton said, eyeing the bunkhouse, "because I heard she was sold at auction to a man paid in Confederate silver. And I know you had some left over from the 33rd. Elijah didn't blink. "You still playing bloodhound for the Swan Post Riders?" "I am the Riders now." Dalton said proudly. Official, we do favors for the railmen, for the bankers, for anyone who pays good coin to clean up forgotten messes. He turned and spat over the railing. And Josie Mays left behind a mess. Her mama sold her, sure, but she was supposed to go to New Atlanta, not out here with you. Elijah leaned against the post. She's not here. Dalton stepped closer. She caring, ain't she? You think she's yours now? You think you can raise that child and wash your hands of everything? Before Elijah didn't answer, the silence drew out like a gun barrel. Dalton sniffed the air. You always were the quiet type. That's why you made such a good butcher back in the war. Cut a man down, then pray for him while he bled. Elijah moved his hand toward the rifle. Slowly. Dalton noticed but didn't flinch. Relax, he said. We ain't here to burn your shack down. Not yet. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Wanted for unlawful transport of property under federal writ. Josie Mays, runaway. Fugitive. $100 to whoever brings her in breathing, $50 if she ain't. He tucked the paper into Elijah's coat pocket. You got 2 days, preacher man. Then we come back. We check every floorboard, every outhouse, every grave. Elijah didn't speak. The men turned and rode off without another word. Josie was in the barn. She'd heard everything. Her face was gray eyes sunken. Who are they? She asked. Riders from Swan Post, Elijah said. They won't leave you be. She sat down slow on a sack of oats, hand pressing to her stomach. They used to watch the girls in the mining camps. Sometimes they'd take one. Say it was for the bankers, for the landowners. We weren't allowed to scream. Elijah stared at her jaw tight. The man who got you with child, he said carefully. Was it one of them? She looked up. No. Her eyes flicked toward the bunkhouse window. It was someone else. But he's dead now. She didn't explain. Elijah didn't ask. That night he unlatched the trapdoor beneath the parlor rug. Inside was an oilskin-wrapped case, heavy and cold. He brought out a rifle with a worn wooden stock initials burned into the handle EV. Alongside it, a rusted saber from his cavalry days and a pouch of bullets he'd sworn he'd never use again. In the barn, Josie paced through contractions that hadn't begun yet, but she knew were coming. The child was restless, like it knew something was out there circling. Elijah sat on the porch watching the road as the sun went down. His hand rested on the rifle. The wind picked up. And for the first time in years, he whispered a prayer. Not for forgiveness, but for courage. The sky was split open with lightning before dawn. Elijah had been riding hard all night, leading the mule. Josie rode through gulches and across dry creek beds, the girl swaying in the saddle, one hand gripping the reins, the other pressed to her lower belly as though holding the child in. The contractions had started, slow at first, manageable. Now they came every few minutes, sharper than the ones before. Josie's breath came in ragged gasps, eyes wide as if staring into something only she could see. Hold on, Elijah said more than once, not for comfort, for her survival. Behind them, dust plumes rose over the ridge like smoke signals. The riders from Swan Post had found their trail. Elijah knew this country better than they did. But they had speed, they had numbers, and they had hatred boiling behind their guns. Just past Barlow Ridge, the canyon walls opened into a box valley long since abandoned by settlers who couldn't tame its winds. There stood the husk of a burned-out church, charred beams jutting like ribs from the earth. Elijah had come here before. Years ago, when grief had turned him bitter, he knew the land gave few ways in, and only one way out. He helped Josie down, half carrying her inside what was left of the sanctuary. Rain leaked through holes in the roof, drumming on blackened pews. It's starting, Josie whispered, doubling over. Dear God, it's starting. Elijah laid out a bedroll over dry planks, made a circle of stones for warmth, lit a fire with shaking hands. He'd delivered calves before. Never a child. You'll be all right, he muttered. I've seen worse. You haven't seen this, she cried, clenching her teeth, a line of blood trailing down her leg. He turned toward the doorway. heard the hooves, the voices close, no more than minutes away. He stood rifle in hand. "Stay quiet," he said. "If I don't come back, run toward the gulch. Don't stop, don't look back." Josie's breath hitched. "You can't stop them." "I don't need to stop them," Elijah said. "Just slow them down." He stepped out into the storm. Rain lashed sideways across his face. The wind howled through the broken timbers. And across the field, just as dawn began to stretch its gray fingers over the land, came Dalton Pike and the other two riders, guns drawn, eyes glittering with certainty. "Didn't think you'd run," Dalton said, grinning. "But you always did have a flair for the dramatic." Elijah said nothing, just raised his rifle and fired once. The shot clipped Dalton's hat clean off, sent it spinning into the mud. The other riders scattered for cover, one returning fire. A round slammed into the beam beside Elijah's head. He ducked, rolled into the shadows of the ruined chapel, fired twice more. The man with the scar went down screaming, clutching his leg. The younger one flanked left, trying to get around behind the church. Elijah moved quick, too quick. He slipped on wet boards, slammed hard into a wall. His shoulder dislocated with a sickening pop. He bit back a cry. No time for pain. The girl screamed inside, raw and rising, a sound of life and death tangled into one. Elijah dragged himself up, left arm hanging loose, and stumbled toward the back. The boy was there, gun raised, finger trembling. He couldn't have been more than 20. Elijah leveled his own weapon. They locked eyes. Neither moved. "Don't do this," Elijah said low. "Walk away." The boy hesitated, just long enough for a noise to break between them, the scream of a newborn, pure, piercing, alive. The boy's eyes widened. Elijah didn't shoot. The boy didn't either. He backed away. Ran. Dalton saw him go. Roared in rage, fired wildly into the church. Elijah returned fire, caught Dalton in the thigh. The outlaw fell to one knee, mud coating his coat, blood spreading down his leg. "She ain't yours," Dalton spat. "You think you get to make it right by saving her? You're still a murderer, Voss." Elijah stepped forward, battered and bleeding. "I know what I am," he said. "But I'm still standing." Dalton raised his revolver. Elijah fired first. The bullet punched through Dalton's chest, sending him backward into the mud, mouth open in a soundless curse. Rain washed over him. Then silence. Elijah stood breathing hard, shoulder numb, hand shaking. The world had narrowed to smoke and blood and the sound of a child crying inside the broken walls. He dropped the rifle, went back in. Josie lay pale and slick with sweat, her dress soaked through, the infant in her arms. Small, pink, impossibly alive. "It's a girl," she whispered. Elijah fell to his knees beside them. "She's breathing," Josie said, half in awe. "She's really breathing." He reached out, hands trembling. Josie didn't stop him. The child blinked at the world, her tiny fists clenched, her mouth opening into a soft wail. Elijah looked into her face and felt something old inside him begin to crack, like thawed ice under a spring sun. "She's real," he said. "She's here." Behind them, the fire in the stones flickered low. Rain hissed through holes in the roof. Somewhere nearby, a coyote called into the waking light. Josie closed her eyes, cradling the child to her chest. "You saved us," she murmured. Elijah shook his head. "Not yet." He turned toward the doorway. The field was empty now, filled only with mist and blood and rain. The riders were gone. But the truth was still coming. They returned to the ranch 3 days later, worn to the bone. Elijah's shoulder was wrapped tight beneath his coat, every movement stabbing with pain. Josie rode the mule, holding the infant wrapped in a wool shawl Elijah had stored in an old chest marked EV 1866. The storm had passed, but the land was soaked, the trail soft underfoot, like the earth was still deciding whether to swallow them whole or let them pass. At the ranch, Elijah helped Josie down, careful not to touch the child unless invited. She didn't say much, just looked around like she was seeing it new, like the near death had wiped away something, maybe fear, maybe hate, maybe both. That night she asked if she could bury the afterbirth and bloodied cloth near the cottonwoods. "She should be close to your wife," Josie said, and Elijah just nodded, throat too tight to speak. He He dug the shallow grave by lamplight, his good arm trembling, each shovel full, making him wince. When it was done, she stepped forward with the bundle, laid it in gently, and whispered something Elijah couldn't hear. The child slept through it all, cradled against her chest. The next day, Elijah fixed a cradle from an old drawer and some pine boards. Josie smiled when she saw it. "She'll like that," she said. "Babies know when something's made from love." Elijah didn't reply. But later he ran a hand over the smooth rail he'd sanded and whispered the name to himself, Clara. That night, Josie came to the main house. She stood in the doorway while Elijah sat by the fire pipe unlit, staring into the flames like they could speak. "I need to tell you something," she said. "It might break this." He looked up, nodded. She sat across from him, the baby asleep in her arms. "You asked back in the canyon about the man who got me pregnant, if he was one of the riders." Elijah nodded slowly. "He wasn't," Josie said, "but he was with them once, long before the mining camps. He was a bounty scout back when the Swan Post Riders worked for the Confederates. His name was Caleb Dreer." Elijah's face didn't change, but something inside him shrank. "I know that name," he said. Josie looked down at her child. "I think you do." She pulled a small locket from around her neck, the chain frayed. She handed it to Elijah. He opened it. Inside was a drawing, not a photograph, done in charcoal. A man with sharp eyes, wild hair, and a scar down his chin. Caleb Dreer. Elijah had last seen that face crumpling to the dirt of a red gully in Texas, eyes open, heart bleeding into the sand. He remembered the rifle shot, his rifle, and the way the body had dropped heavy as sin. "He was yours," Josie said. "You killed him." Elijah didn't deny it. Just closed the locket and set it gently on the table between them. "He was raiding the wrong side of the line," he said. "Killing farmers, scalping children. I shot him before he could burn down a house with a woman still inside. That woman was my aunt," Josie said. "I know that part. And I know he deserved to die. But he was still my father." She looked at Elijah. Her voice didn't tremble. "He was the one who got my mama pregnant when she was 14. And when I turned 16, she did the same to me, passed me along like some cursed heirloom. She said it was what women in our blood were meant for." Elijah stared at the fire. His voice was barely a breath. "I'm sorry, I know," she said. "That's not why I told you." "Then why?" he asked. She looked down at the baby. "Because I need to know if she's cursed too." The fire crackled. Rain tapped soft on the windows. Elijah leaned forward, both hands wrapped around his knees. "She's not," he said. "You broke it." "How you ran," he said. "You bled for her. You risked her life for something better. That's not what cursed people do." Josie's eyes glistened. She reached over and laid the sleeping child in the cradle. The baby stirred, yawned, settled. Elijah stood slowly, crossed to the mantel. He picked up the photograph, the one of his wife, long dead. He set it face down. Then he turned to Josie. "This house was full of ghosts," he said. "Now it's not." She stepped forward close enough to touch. "Then maybe we both broke something," she whispered. Elijah nodded. Then for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry quietly without shame as the child slept beside him and the storm moved on. Morning came with wind in the wheat and hush in the trees. Elijah stood beside the cottonwoods, the child in his arms, wrapped tight in a quilt Josie had stitched from old feed sacks. She was 2 weeks old now, strong-lunged and wide-eyed, with fists that gripped his finger like a promise. Josie stood a few feet away, watching her hand resting on the grave marker Elijah had carved the night before. It wasn't much, a plain cedar plank, smoothed and simple, but with 2 names burned into it now, Clara Voss, an unnamed daughter of Mercy. Why that she'd asked him. "Because that's what you gave her," he said. "Mercy." He knelt in the dirt, laying a sprig of prairie rose on the grave beside the old one, his wife's. The same tree shaded them both now. The same wind blew through their branches. "She never knew her name," Josie whispered. "But you did." Elijah nodded. "She didn't live long, but she lived long enough to change me." He stood and placed the child back in Josie's arms. The baby blinked in the morning light, then closed her eyes again, content against her mother's chest. "What will you do now?" he asked. Josie looked out across the hills. Don't rightly know. Maybe stay for a while. Help rebuild the barn. Teach her to walk on good ground. Elijah didn't argue. There's room, he said, and work. She smiled faintly. Thought you'd be asking me to move on. He looked down at the graves, then up at her. You're already home. That evening, Elijah walked out alone to the cottonwoods. He carried the old cavalry saber, the one with blood from too many years, and buried it deep beside the oldest grave. Not to forget, but to end it. When he turned to go, he found Josie standing nearby holding the baby. Thought maybe we'd plant something, she said, nodding at the patch of earth. Make it bloom. Elijah smiled, faint but full. Then let's start now. Together they knelt in the dirt and pressed seeds into the soil: prairie rose, columbine, wild tobacco. Things that take root slow but hold fast. As they worked, the baby cooed softly in Josie's arms, one tiny hand reaching toward the sky. That night the fire in the hearth burned steady. Josie hummed a tune no one else remembered, rocking Clara as the stars blinked overhead. Elijah sat nearby, mending a fence rail by lantern light, his hands no longer shaking. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods like a breath too deep to name. Not grief, not guilt. Something after, something softer. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would speak of a ranch with wildflowers blooming out past the ridge, where an old man and a quiet woman raised a girl who walked like she belonged to the earth. No one ever found the other riders. No one asked about the graves, but folks said that if you stood beneath those trees at dusk, you could hear wind chimes that weren't there, or maybe prayers still hanging in the air. And sometimes, just sometimes, a child's laughter would echo down the hill, bright as sun on river water. If this story stirred something in you, a flicker of sorrow, a breath of hope, a reminder that even broken people can build something whole, then don't walk away just yet. Subscribe to the channel for more true-hearted Western tales where grit meets grace and ordinary souls carry the weight of legend. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next story riding in on the wind.